One of the biggest discussions happening in GP practices right now is whether incorporation is the right move. So welcome back to Beyond the Balance Sheet. I'm Katie Collin, and in this episode, we are going to be talking about GP practice incorporation and whether it's tax efficient, does it give you more financial security, and crucially, what happens to that all-important NHS contract. Just to know, if this is not done properly, it has some pretty significant legal and financial consequences. So to help us unpack this, I'm joined by Justin Cumberlege, who's a healthcare lawyer at Hempsons. He works with GP practices all across the country and has tons of experience, especially working with PCNs and federations as well. We're going to be talking about the key considerations, the common pitfalls, and everything you need to know about practice incorporation. So Justin, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a delight to have you on the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Katie, very much for inviting me. And it's a pleasure always to be working with Ramsey Brown.
So you're joining me today to talk about practice incorporation, which seems to be a really hot topic at the moment. We've had loads of people coming to us talking about having interest in incorporating their GP practice. I don't know if that's something that you're experiencing as well.
Yes, we've had quite a few inquiries coming through. I have to be honest, not a lot have actually decided to incorporate. There was a bit of a rush, I should think, well, you probably can tell me better than I can remember, but about 10 years ago when there was a real tax advantage to incorporating. And nowadays, I think really people are thinking about incorporating for a couple of reasons. One is liability, which was always the reason for incorporation. I mean, back in 1865, when the companies started, it was to help ship owners to limit their personal liabilities. And nowadays, that also can be a driving reason for doing it.
Yeah.
The other one probably is succession, because of the number of new GPs qualifying who don't want to become partners, and the idea of having to buy into a partnership is not that attractive. And so sometimes if it's a company, there's much more flexibility around a company structure than there is a partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you're obviously very well versed in the world of primary care. So before we kind of jump into that, just tell us a bit about some of the work you do at Hempsons with regards to primary care and GP practices and your experience around this.
Hempsons is a firm of 150 lawyers, and we're based throughout the country from Southampton up to Newcastle, Harrogate, Manchester, and London in between. And we act for about 750 GP practices at any particular time, doing their partnership deeds at one level, and their property work. And then we're also helping with their PCNs, their federations, and unfortunately, disputes as well fall into our bag.
Yeah, I'm sure. I was probably seeing a few more of those than maybe we did before. But it is interesting. I mean, I think what you were kind of talking about there as well, the landscape changing. So we've got different vehicles like primary care networks now. We're seeing working at scale. And you touched briefly on, what some of the reasons that practices might look at that. Why now do you think practices are really exploring incorporation?
Well, I think one of the drivers on that is the PCNs and the influx or the ability to recruit lots of different people with different training. So we started very light, just with the pharmacists, lead pharmacists, and the social care providers. But now we've got a whole range of different disciplines. And with the PCNs, no one, or quite a lot of the partners of the partnerships didn't quite know who was looking after them, who was making sure everything was being done, and so on. And became a bit of a nervousness about reliability. And of course, when you're a partner, it's your house on the line.
Yeah.
And with a company, is probably £1 share or something like that. And the other thing is that there are quite a lot of services which you can perhaps bid for. And with the new procurement regime, there's opportunities there, but with opportunities come risk.
Absolutely.
And you're less likely to take the risk if you know that your family might end up homeless if you get it wrong, than if you know that it's been properly ring-fenced. We've even seen it with GPs who own pharmacies, who have developed a pharmacy next to the GP practice. And with the challenges that had, and they have started to lose money and had to close it down, and sometimes at a loss. But fortunately, because they put it into a company, they managed to ring fence that loss. It hasn't impacted them personally, financially, in the way it would have done if it had been their own money.
So that's really the primary driver, isn't it? Is, as you said, to ring fence that liability. I mean, do you think people are convinced by this idea about taxing companies and that being more efficient? Did you hear that a lot, if anyone interested?
Well, I tend to refer them to you, Katie, on those sort of things, because I know that it's not straightforward.
No. Yeah, we find a lot of people like the idea of the tax efficiency of a company, but as you know, that actually once you go to take the money out, it becomes a lot more expensive and things have changed. But it is interesting, this is a sort of tax myth that exists in terms of companies. I suppose really the main pro then of doing this is to ring fence your liability. And you mentioned a bit about succession planning as well.
Yes, so I think the succession planning is an interesting one because it means that you can bring a new partner in, but they won't be a partner, they will be a director and a shareholder. And if you've got... the thing with GP practices, of course, you're not valuing goodwill. So they are relatively cheap as a business. I mean, if you valued the goodwill, each GP practice, is going to be well over £1 million. We know that from dental practices. But with GP practices, you haven't got that. But still, there's an asset base there. And if there's a property, then, of course, you might be talking about that, well over that sum, possibly. And so when you've moved into an area as a new GP and you've probably taken an eye-watering amount for a mortgage, you've also got your student loans still being paid off. So you're saddled with debt. And then your partnership say, well, why don't you become a partner and buy into the practice premises? And you just look at this other huge amount of money that is going to be a debt. And although you might think, well, it's all going to turn out all right in the end is when you're 60. And when you're 30, that seems a long way off. And it is. And anything could happen in between. So the thing with companies is that you have shares. And so instead of having to buy into your 1/3 share or 1/5 share or whatever it is, you could just buy 3%. And you could just say, well, here are 3 shares, and next year you'll have 5 shares. And so you could sort of build it up incrementally. And also when you leave, you resign as a director, you sell your shares on whatever basis that you agreed to value it, and you're away, as it were. Whereas with a partnership, there tends to be a lot more to disentangle. I sometimes say it's like a divorce. But it's worse because it's just about the money.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we've had our fair experience of that. And I think the point you made about buying in, we saw with the new to partnership scheme, there are a few GPs who were more likely to become a partner because they felt reassured that that capital element was funded. But since that's gone, it's actually quite difficult for people to come into partnership now. So maybe having the vehicle of a limited company could give them some benefit. I think it's quite difficult because traditionally GPs have always been partnerships. So it's quite a different model to get your head around, isn't it, in terms of how a company actually operates?
Absolutely. And I think one of the interesting things is with the new contract that's they say will come out for the 1st of April 2026 or maybe 27, which is probably more realistic because they want to do a major overhaul. they are talking about LLPs. So under the current system, regulations, you're allowed to have a company, a limited liability company, but not an LLP. I did speak to the solicitor who was responsible for the 2004 reforms when the GMS contract came out. And I did ask why they didn't have LLPs. And they simply said, we forgot about them. And they were quite new at that time. And although a very few accountants and solicitors had changed their LLPs, it was a very few. And it only really gained traction in about 2007-8. But the advantage with the LLP, limited liability partnership, is that you can be like a partner, but you have a limited liability. However, you don't get that flexibility with having sort of subsidiary companies, making up groups. So we had a federation which actually set up 3 different companies, not initially, but as they grew. So one was the general sort of trading company, which took the contracts and employed most of the staff and was sort of running the medical services. The second company was a not-for-profit company, and that was really for training and education purposes.
Because you get an exemption, of course, around the VAT if you're in a not-for-profit company.
Quite. So they set it up for that. And also they wanted the trainers to take ownership and develop it and then offer their training schemes to other areas. So they weren't wholly just dependent on their practices. So it had a life of its own, which they wanted. And then the third was the property. And so those that wanted to invest in the property, in the estate, could do. And again, as I was explaining earlier, they could just take some shares in it. They didn't have to take a whole amount. And so that worked quite well, that sort of group. I mean, one has to remember that, again, the way that the regulations work, they're very much focused on a GP practice being a partnership.
Absolutely.
And so when you talk about rent and rates reimbursement, if you're not the partners owning the property, you're suddenly into an investment model. And there you find that the banks, instead of having 100% value to loan, are going at 60% value to loan. So you're suddenly got to find 40%, which is a big difference.
A big 40% of a big number is a very big number still. So absolutely.
And then when you've got an investor, you then got to say, how is that investor going to ensure their investment is looked after? And how is the practice going to claim the rent and rates reimbursement? Well, the answer is it has to have a lease. So the investors have to grant a lease to the business partnership, and then they have stamp duty land tax.
So it's getting really complicated.
And they've got to have a district valuer to approve it. And there are various rules about where the investors are the same as the partners and things like that. So as I said, it's not well set up at the moment, which is perhaps one of the things that makes the attraction of incorporating your own practice work a bit more better, because you are still the party which is owning the GMS contract. Every time a shareholder director leaves, there's no change. It's still owned by the company, which then holds the contract. So the company is therefore in perpetuity, and so is the contract. So that part of it runs really simply and smoothly, which is another attractive option.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's very attractive to a lot of the sort of younger GPs coming through. I mean, one of the models that's interesting to explore, and I'd love to hear your view on this, is the difference between directors and shareholders, because of course in our traditional GP partnership you have a partner and the partner is personally liable, as we talked about, but they're the only owner manager, whereas of course with the company you can distinguish the difference between a director and a shareholder, an owner and a manager, and you can also give people different types of shareholdings as well, can't you? So there's an opportunity there, I think, in terms of succession planning, where you can distinguish the difference between who owns and who manages and what type of ownership they have. Of course, in a general partnership, you can't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a bit more limited in the GP world, because to be an owner or a director of a GP company, you have to be a qualifying person. So it's not like you can just go out into the world at large and say, why don't you invest? You could for your property, but again, you're coming back to what I was talking about and the separate lease and so on. We did do one where a charity was set up, and the charity bought the land and developed the health centre and then let it to the GP practice. And that, of course, charities have certain tax advantages as well.
Yeah.
Because we all know that when a partner changes, it's an online thing. You just go online, you tell the you tell the ICB of your change of partner, and then it's sort of, hey presto, it happens sort of thing. But when you're changing from a partnership to a company is a separate legal body. And sometimes people find that difficult to grasp. As you're saying, if you think in terms of the partnership is me and I am the partnership, the company isn't you and you are not the company.
No,
it is the shareholders, and they are not the company, is its separate legal body. And so the contract actually has to be given to that company.
And I mean, the point you make about the separate identity, I mean, the company has its own address, its own name, its own incorporation date, its own articles about how it runs. And I think that's a big shift from what we've seen before. You're right. It's a separation between those two things.
Yeah.
So interesting to hear about what are the actual practical steps in terms of, we talk about changing the contract. Yeah. How does that work from your experience?
You have to put forward a business case to the ICB. The ICB will want to ensure that there is no risk to patient safety. And included in that is that there's a long-term future for the company and the practice. And they are quite nervous about companies being formed because they know that if a company goes bust, the GPs can just walk away.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's a partnership, the GPs can't just walk away because they've got the personal liable.
Yeah.
So it's all a bit more tricky. So they will look at the sustainability of the company, and they will want to know that it is properly incorporated, that the people who own the shares are all eligible people under the 2006 Act and under the regulations, and that they can hold a GMS or PMS contract. The other thing they have to be convinced about is that they don't have to go out to public procurement. So I'm not going to talk about the provider selection regime now because that is a podcast on its own.
Forever, yeah.
But they do have to think whether it should go out to open tender. So this business case that you put to them has to convince them that you are the only people that this contract should go to and that you are a safe pair of hands. And it's quite a lengthy document. It is published, and so you can have a look and see what you have to say. And when you answer all those questions convincingly, then they can agree that the contract will, what lawyers talk about, novated. What it is the same contract going to the company, except in legal terms, it is a new contract between the ICB and the new company. It tends to have some legacy guarantees from those who are the old partnership, and those partners have to state that they will be responsible for any legacy requirements, if there's a clawback, for example. Interestingly, quite often a novation agreement will say that the new contractor is also responsible for those legacy things, which is fine. If you are the owners of a new company, you're sort of no worse off than you would have been. If you are, say, a federation taking over a partnership, then you need to have done your due diligence to make sure you're not picking up any of those liabilities.
That could be massive, especially with pensions. And we do a huge amount with pensions. And we see all these historic liabilities of, particularly with salary GPs who might not known to do their type 2, with potentially huge clawbacks of overpayments. And often, when partners have changed, there's sort of no records and it just sort of is a creditor that kind of gets carried forward. So you're taking on effectively that liability into a new company. That could be quite significant without the correct due diligence, as you say.
Yes. The pensions one, fortunately, you can normally park because you change your employer code if you take over the contract. Actually, that probably isn't true if you're going from a partnership to the new company. Yeah. But if you're a federation taking over a practice, so the liabilities you're taking over is any which originate from the contract. So if there could be clawback, if for instance, they had overclaimed for health checks or something like that, then you could be responsible for that. So that's where your due diligence comes in.
Absolutely.
And then you need a business transfer agreement, which would specify some warranties that are given by the transferring organisation. And even if you, as a partnership, are incorporating, you still need a business transfer agreement from yourselves as individuals, as a partnership, to the new company, which is, as I said, a new legal entity. So you sort of have to think of this as a new person. And so there is, it's a lightweight business transfer agreement, but it is still a business transfer agreement that needs to be put in place. So there's quite a lot to think about. I mean, because you've got the novation of your contract, you've got to make sure your new company is CQC registered, and you've got to make sure it's a NHS employer in order to give your staff NHS pensions.
Yeah. And for those of us who've been dealing with that on the PCN side, knows there's this chicken and egg argument of, you can't get pension access until you've tupied the staff, but you don't want to tupie the staff until you know that they can get the pension access. And so it takes time.
Yeah, and you can't tupie the staff until you've got the contract.
Yeah.
So you've got to have your novation in place, and you can't have your contract until you've got CQC. So it's chicken and egg, and it's scrambled eggs. I mean, trying to get the whole thing to work together and all to happen on the D-Day is actually can be quite challenging. And then, of course, you've got your property because you need to transfer your property to the new company, and that means you've got to have the district valuer's valuation, because you're potentially changing the basis of your rent reimbursement. Is it notional rent from actual lease rent or from you owning it as partners? So you've got to make sure all of that's aligned. The ICB will let that flow through normally, but you still got to do the transfer and make sure you're not breaching any restrictive covenants. And if it's a lease, you've got to get the landlord to agree to it. And quite a lot of medical centre developers do not want a company as their tenant. They rather like having partners as tenants because of the personal liability again.
Absolutely.
So what they might say is, okay, well, we will accept your company as a tenant as long as you are guarantors.
Which
you haven't limited your liability.
Exactly, yeah. And we find actually when these conversations start to happen with the landlords, it gives rise to other issues that might come around, particularly around things around sort of dilapidations, or there isn't a signed lease, and then they want you to sign a lease. And we know there are pros and cons to having a signed lease. So it's definitely not straightforward, and there's a lot to think about, I think, when you're going to do this. So is there a perfect scenario or a time where you think incorporation of a practice is really valid?
Yes, particularly where we have mergers of practices. We had 5 practices merging, and they had a really good business case for doing it, which wasn't, we're all failing and therefore if we all get together, we'll make a success. That rarely happens. If you're all failing, it's just going to be a big failure and you're not going to get it past the ICB. But this was, a couple of practices were, to be honest, struggling, but the other 3 were powerful. They were all in a PCN together. and they decided to merge together. We did float the idea of why not set up a company? And this was going to help with profit shares because you could flex the number of shares that everybody had. And then you could say, if some have many more shares than others, but over time, shall we see if we can start to equal them out? And so you could put in option agreements. The great thing with companies, even though the Companies Act is 1,000 sections long, there's actually a lot of flexibility in there while you've got to be in that structure. So the structure is the boundaries, which is good to have. So there are boundaries. But within that, there are multiple different ways of doing things. And the thing about coming to corporate lawyers is that we do think a bit differently from sort of GP practices. And we've, done large corporate structures, and we've dealt with software companies, and so there's quite a lot of things that you might not have thought about if you're GP, and why should you have done, which we can introduce, and maybe the perfect solution for what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Definitely when we're seeing working at scale and these larger practices or practices coming together, I think it's going to be so relevant. I mean, we've seen practices who may have different types of sides of their business. So as you were saying, having a group structure where you might have different companies doing different things with potentially different ownership as well, it could be really interesting. Do you think that maybe if a company, as a GP practice as a company or an incorporation, do you think that might give rise to thinking about GP practices in a more entrepreneurial, more business-like manner? Because I think at the moment there's quite a big link, as we talked about, that sort of owner-managed business. They think of themselves very much as clinicians looking after their patients. Of course, we don't want to affect patient outcomes, but there's definitely a drive now to think of GP practices more like a business, especially with things like national insurance going up, cost of living. We've talked about this before. Do you think maybe having that governance structure would make them think about this more like an actual business that they need to run with good financial governance?
Yeah, potentially and hopefully. I think what it really does and can do is let those doctors who came into medicine to look after patients spend a lot more time looking after patients and being more confident about having other people looking after the business, because you've got that business structure in place and you can have proper job titles and contracts and so on. Obviously, that comes with an expense. And so you need to be quite large to create the surpluses in order to pay for that. But you can probably sleep better at night, not only because you haven't got that liability around your neck, but also you're able to be really looking after and caring for your patients. And if that's a driver, then maybe incorporation might actually be something to help you with that as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of GPs would like to sleep better at night or even have the hours to be able to sleep at night. So I certainly think that would be a point of focus. But any kind of pain points that you think would come up when you're incorporating, anything that you could maybe anticipate in advance?
I think it's getting all those things. Actually, I mean, it's, what's your property situation? I mean, we've got one which is fast going wrong because of the landlord just will not accept an incorporation, an incorporated entity.
Yeah.
Where I think the other one is CQC can take an age. To get your CQC registration.
Yeah, and getting the order of those things correct as well, I think is really hard.
I mean, with CQC, somebody put in their application, I think it was taking sort of like 8 or 9 months.
Yeah.
And when they nearly got there, they said, oh, well, your DBS checks are more than a year old. So you now got to go back and do your DBS checks. So I said, okay, we'll do those. And then they said, now you've got to put in a fresh application. Which was just cruel, actually, because it was another 8 months, wait.
Yeah.
So it's all those sort of things which start to, and as you said, it's a sort of chicken and egg, having everything ready on time.
And actually, one thing I wanted to ask was, do you think that the change around NHS England and ICBs, do you think that's going to have an impact on this? Because traditionally it's been the ICB that we've been dealing with, and we don't really
No,
know
so
how this new
ICBs
landscape.
will stay very
Yeah.
much, but because it becomes the Secretary of State, that they're just going to become part of NHS England, as it were.
Yeah.
And so the Secretary of State will still have to have regional and district offices. If I said regional health authorities, of course, I'm just showing my age. And if I'm talking about district health authorities or even FHSAs, it would even, some people will have a wry smile at that point. But I think you will have, I think the support will continue to diminish. And we saw that when you changed from PCTs to CCGs,
yeah.
there was, and then it sort of slowly, incrementally increased a bit. But I think that support, the problem is you lost a lot of people with experience and knowledge when that happened. I think that might happen again.
I was going to say, we're talking about sort of 50% cuts. So I think that relationship with the ICB, where you've built that relationship, if that person's not there, that's something to anticipate during this process, that you might be dealing with some of the ICB you don't know.
Yeah, but there's always a mistake thinking that the commissioner is your friend, and when you're in trouble, go and talk to them. Actually, of course, their role is they are the police force. So you might well want to go to the police at times, but you need to think carefully what you're going to go and talk to them about. Because if you go and say to them, we are in a lot of financial trouble, so we're going to incorporate our practice, you've just told them
you're
not
in financial trouble.
Well, we're not going to accept your business plan.
How's that going to affect patient outcomes?
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So think about what you're going to say and sort your home turf out first. Actually, you need to be a viable, functioning, coordinated GP practice before you apply for incorporation.
Absolutely. Having the systems and also the financial means to do this. That's one of the things they'll look at is, we don't like to use the word profit in primary care, but actually the fact is can you run a business?
Exactly.
And, are you financially viable? And having that infrastructure and those systems is absolutely key as well to be able to make that application. So, Any last pieces of advice or words of wisdom for those practices thinking of incorporating?
I would say that the first thing is, what's your vision for the future? Have your away day, perhaps get somebody to come and help you plan it, and think about, where do you want to be in, say, 5 years' time? And what do you want your practice to look like then? And then work backwards from there. So if that's where you want to be in 5 years' time, then how are you going to get there? What are you going to do in year 1, year 2, year 3, etc.? And what are your targets for doing that? That's easier said than done when you're working in a political climate where things you can have a paradigm shift totally outside your control. But if you're working towards a goal, then it's sort of funny how when those big things happen, your focus doesn't have to change that much. And you can still see how in a new environment, you can still work for that goal. Then if your vision is that it's going to be difficult for a number of reasons, then talk to Ramsey Brown, Katie, and come and please talk to us at Hempsons. And we can help you look at different ways of doing things so that make that vision a reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think weathering the storm in a constantly changing environment where we've sort of have backdated changes, we don't know what's coming next. Absolutely, the resilience is key, and having the professionals behind you to give you that resilience is no doubt got to be a good thing. So, Justin, thank you so much for joining me today to explore the incorporation of GP practices. I think it's given us a lot to think about. And what I would say is, if anyone is thinking about incorporating, definitely get in touch. We've touched on a few of those issues today, but I think the main thing is to get some professional advice and make sure, as you said, that you're doing that planning right at the beginning. You understand why you're doing this and getting the right tools in place to help you. And like you said, Justin, make this vision a reality. So thank you, Justin. That's
Thank you very much.
really interesting. Thank you. Next episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Diane Holden, who is our partnership manager at Xero, with whom we are platinum partners. Diane and I are going to be talking about Making Tax Digital, or MTD, which is coming into force in income tax in April 2026. So don't miss our next episode with Beyond the Balance Sheet.